Today we're jumping from time in Mark to Matthew. Now, the difference between the Gospels is important for how we approach them. So, Mark, as we've talked about, is the oldest one. It was written before the temple was destroyed. And in it, the people don't know who Jesus is, and they continuously make the mistake until the very end. We, as the listeners, are pulled in to continue telling the story. Matthew is a different gospel. Matthew was concerned about the Hebrew community around the writer at the time and making them understand that Jesus' message was completely within the Hebrew tradition and that we really had to solidify the Hebrew tradition before we moved out of it. So, a very different intent in Matthew. In Matthew this morning, what we look at is a story of forgiveness. And it talks about the parable of the master with the servant or slave. And he wants to punish the servant and his family for a debt that was not paid. And the servant said, "Oh, please forgive me, give me more time." And then we follow that servant to another servant who owes him money, and he doesn't even use the same kind of compassion or grace for the second servant. And then the master finds out, and he gets really enraged, and he puts the first servant that he did forgive into into a place of punishment, where until the master was satisfied, the servant was going to have to stay. So the act of forgiveness is the center core of the gospel this morning, and I find it very difficult this morning to talk about that because before I even got ready to preach this morning, my 16-year-old son and I had a bit of an altercation, and I apologized for it, and he wouldn't accept that apology. He was still really snipey about it. Sometimes the Holy Spirit puts things in our paths to make us realize we're not superior beings at all. We've got our own issues with some of the things that come up in the Bible, those of us who preach. We're not giving lessons because we have it all worked out. We're just giving respect and reflections on this stuff because we've spent a lot more time thinking about it and studying what maybe the first communities of Hebrews had talked about and listened. And one of the first things we come across, not only is that we all fall into this category of the master and the first servant and the second servant, but the first thing we come across is Peter saying to Jesus, "How many times am I supposed to forgive someone? 7 times?" Now, the Hebrew culture that Peter and Jesus were part of was one that had a lot of vengeance, a lot of saving face. Families would go to feuds with each other just to make sure everything was, you know, who the dominant one was, that everything was going to be settled in the favor of whichever one felt that they were the most justified. And society watched this. So, this is why family was so important. If you messed up, then family would come in and they would help you save face. Apologizing was not part of the deal. Showing that you were contrite or that you hadn't done something properly, that was worship stuff. That wasn't action in everyday life stuff. So when Peter posts the question, should we forgive someone 7 times? That was already a huge stretch for what was commonly done. And Jesus comes back and says, no, you're supposed to forgive someone 70 times 7. Huge numbers. I mean, this it represents infinity because again, the Hebrew culture, when they saw the word seven, seven meant completeness or perfection. Remember, 7 days that it took to create the universe. 7 matriarchs and patriarchs. 7 days they walked around Jericho before the city fell. So 7 has the significance of being part of God's plan. So it's not just a number that Peter picked out of nowhere or that Jesus pulled out just because. So this idea that you're supposed to constantly forgive people is what we're supposed to be about as Christians, right? We're supposed to forgive and forget is what we're told. Now, interesting cultural part on that is the whole idea of forgive and forget, that's not biblical. No one in the Bible ever says forget. In fact, one of the most used verbs in the Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures, is actually zakar, which means remember. So Jesus never said forgive and forget. Where we get that is actually, believe it or not, King Lear, and a century later, Don Quixote. And that just came into our common sense of culture. it makes kind of cultural sense that people would mistake it for the Bible because the translation to English was happening right around the same time Shakespeare was writing. So all of that kind of came into our cultural memory and awareness at the same time. But it's not biblical. So if Jesus is asking us to forgive, but there's no word on forgetting, then what do we do with that 70 times 7? Well, here's the thing. It is not about forgiving a person 70 times 7 for the same mistake. You're not supposed to forget that someone hurt you. You're not supposed to forget that they took something they shouldn't or said something they shouldn't. We're not supposed to have that level of cultural amnesia. We are supposed to learn from mistakes. Maybe we trusted that person and others told us not to, but we did anyway and we paid the price. I mean, that's a story that's pretty common. Or sometimes it's just life teaching us when we have overstepped and we have to back it up. It's not about forgiving the same person for the same act. It's more about going through the action of forgiveness for ourselves. It's not it's not easy to forgive. When I was preparing this sermon, actually earlier this week, I came across the writings of someone who was quite lauded by the commentator, and my entire stomach clenched because that person, that writer, had been extremely mean to my mother. She hadn't defended me at a time when it was really crucial that I had someone stand up for me. And then when my mother died a couple of years later, she took over the funeral and acted like she was my mother's best friend and dictated everything. And my sister let it happen. And I was so enraged by the hypocrisy of this person. Then it took a good solid year for me to really let go and mourn my mother because the rage was there. So here I am, 25 years later, seeing this person's name in print, and my stomach tightens, just like a quarter of a century hadn't happened. I'm not the only one that has that kind of experience. We all do, especially if the hurt is deep. If we have a breakup that we didn't initiate and we just want closure and to understand why that happened, the pain and the rage is there. When we see someone being treated almost like a puppet, you can almost see someone else's hand sticking in their back, making them say things they wouldn't normally say. We're enraged. We get angry. Jesus got angry too. Angry is not a bad thing. But the holding on to it, the holding on to vengeance, the ulcer creating anger that we hold in our stomach is not good for us. Forgiveness is never about the other person. Forgiveness is about us. And that's one thing that is so hard to understand. Forgiveness is a choice. It's not something that is going to be offered automatically. When we wrong someone, we don't have a right to demand that they forgive us right away. If they do, that's a gift of grace, a gift of kindness that we have to figure out a way how to deserve. But that's not where the forgiveness, the expectation lies. The expectation lies in how we go about doing it. Just like love is a choice, forgiveness is a choice. And it's a muscle that we have to keep working. It is never a one and done, especially if the hurt is deep. We don't just forgive people and walk away. We still have to process and maybe seethe a little bit and get underneath of that. But the 70 times 7 is our process, where we have to just look at it every time it comes up and say, I'm going to forgive that. I'm going to push that away. I'm going to be a new person. I'm not going to be that level of anger. I don't want to be that person. And there are certainly enough examples all around us of people who haven't made that choice and who have let bitterness and anger just fester in them. They're not nice people to be around. Do we really want to be like that? Christ is giving us an option, an example of how to not be that embittered person. But it's a muscle. It's like going to the gym. You don't do one bicep curl and think that you're done. You have to do it over and over again, several times a week, weeks on end, months and years on end. That's what forgiveness is. That's the 70 times 7. That we have to keep focusing on it and have to choose to do it. We have to make the choice that I'm going to push that level of discomfiture, of anguish, of pain, of whatever is caused away. That is not what I want defining me. And nowhere in that will I forget, but I won't fixate on it. I won't make that something that affects my personality and changes me from someone who is open into someone who is closed off and angry about things. Jesus continued on to teach in parables because stories are so effective in helping people realize what they're about. The main character of the parable is this first servant who wanted forgiveness for himself but couldn't give it to someone else. And Jesus used the example of money because that's pretty big in our world. Money is one of the great things that causes anger and distrust. But the servant was not prepared to pass along the grace he had been given to someone else. And of course, as parables go, this person was punished. Now, first off, the master threatens his entire family. At the end of the day, it's only him that gets punished. But see, that's the thing about forgiveness. At the end of the day, it is only us that gets punished. We're not going to hurt anybody else. Our forgiveness won't make their world different. If they choose to accept that as grace and change, fantastic. But that's not our journey, that's theirs. Forgiveness helps us along the path. Forgiveness opens us up more to Jesus functioning in our lives, giving us options to give grace to others. Because when we don't do that, when we hold on to the things that destroy us, we are never going to feel part of God's kingdom. We're never going to let those boundaries, those walls go to open us to everything we can receive. And that's how the gospel today ends. That's what the kingdom of heaven. It's not a curse. It's just a statement of reality. If we cannot let go of the things that hold us down, that make us bitter, that make us angry and cranky and resistant, then we are never going to be able to walk into the new community that Jesus has described and that we're all promised. That's the free will part. It's on us. Are we going to walk in? Are we going to let things go? Or are we going to have things fester? We're the only ones that can make that choice. Forgiveness 70 times 7. It's all about us.